On a cold January morning in 1931, a groundskeeper named James Stark walked his usual rounds across the sprawling estate. The Georgia fog hung low over the putting green, muffling sound and blurring the edges of the world. That's when he noticed a car parked where no car should be. At first, Stark assumed it belonged to someone from nearby Emory College, whose faculty were permitted to walk the grounds. But as he approached, a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. Inside the vehicle sat two bodies, a young man and a young woman, both dead from gunshot wounds. The man's hand still rested near an ivory-handled pistol, a pistol that belonged to his employer, the eccentric millionaire who owned this 42-acre wonderland. The gun belonged to Asa Candler Jr., heir to the Coca-Cola fortune, and the mansion that loomed behind the morning mist would never quite shake the shadow of what happened that day. But to understand how death came to visit this place of dreams and excess, we must travel back further still. Back to the dusty roads of rural Georgia, where a boy named Asa Griggs Candler first learned that fortune favored the bold. The story of Briercliffe begins not with marble halls or gilded ballrooms, but with a small-town pharmacist and a peculiar brown syrup that would change the world. Asa Griggs Candler Sr. was born in Villa Rica, Georgia, in 1851, the son of a prosperous merchant and planter. He grew up surrounded by cotton fields and church pews, raised with the twin pillars of hard work and Methodist faith. As a young man, he dreamed not of empire, but of medicine. He became a pharmacist and moved to Atlanta in 1873, setting up shop in a city still healing from the wounds of the Civil War. For 15 years, Candler built a respectable business selling patent medicines. Then, in 1888, something extraordinary happened. A pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton came to him with an unusual proposition. Pemberton had invented a sweet carbonated tonic he called Coca-Cola. He was ill, struggling financially, and needed to sell his creation. For a sum rumored to be just $2,300, Asa Candler Sr. purchased the formula that would make his family one of the wealthiest in America. What Candler saw in that fizzy brown liquid was more than medicine. He saw magic in a bottle. He threw himself into marketing with an evangelist's fervor. He gave away free samples, plastered the Coca-Cola name on everything from calendars to clocks, and demanded that his salesmen spread the gospel of refreshment to every corner of the nation. By 1895, just 7 years after he bought the formula, Coca-Cola was sold in every state and territory in the United States. Asa Candler Sr. had become a millionaire many times over. He diversified into banking and real estate, building the Candler Building in downtown Atlanta, which at 17 stories was the tallest building in the city when it opened in 1906. He developed the Druid Hills neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, transforming swampland and forest into one of the most desirable addresses in the South. He donated millions to establish Emory University, and in 1916, he was elected mayor of Atlanta, leading the city through the Great Fire of 1917 that consumed more than 1,500 homes. But while Asa Sr. was building an empire, his second son was building a reputation of an entirely different kind. Asa Griggs Candler Jr. was born in 1880, the second of 5 children, and the namesake of his increasingly famous father. From the very beginning, something was different about the boy everyone called Buddy. Where his older brother Charles Howard was studious and responsible, Buddy was restless and wild. He struggled in school, couldn't sit still in church, and seemed constitutionally incapable of following rules. Modern observers have speculated he might have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder had he grown up today. His parents didn't know what to do with him. In 1888, the same year his father purchased the Coca-Cola formula, 8-year-old Buddy was sent away. His parents enrolled him in his Aunt Florence's school in Cartersville, Georgia, about 50 miles from home. It was an all-girls school, which tells you something about how desperate they were to find any institution that would take him. His aunt and uncle did their best to straighten him out, but Buddy remained Buddy. He was charming, energetic, and utterly unable to stay focused on anything that didn't interest him. When he finally enrolled at Emory College, following in his older brother's footsteps, Buddy didn't distinguish himself academically. His classmate was Alban Barkley, the future Vice President of the United States. But Buddy was more interested in the nascent automobile industry than in his studies. Cars fascinated him. They represented speed, freedom, and the future. After college, his father sent him west to help establish Coca-Cola bottling plants, hoping that responsibility might mature him. It didn't quite take. Buddy worked hard when something captured his imagination, but his imagination wandered constantly. By 1905, Buddy had married Helen McGill, the beautiful daughter of a Georgia newspaper editor. Helen was everything Atlanta society admired: cultured, graceful, and active in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Atlanta Woman's Club, and the Fine Arts Club. The local papers frequently praised her elegant gowns and impeccable taste. For a time, it seemed like Buddy might settle down. But then their infant son died, and something in Buddy cracked open. He threw himself into work with manic energy, launching project after ambitious project, as if he could outrun grief through sheer velocity. In 1909, Buddy unveiled his most audacious scheme yet: the Atlanta Speedway. He had become obsessed with automobile racing, and he built a 2-mile track that would be the finest in the South. For 2 years, the Speedway brought national attention to Atlanta. Racing celebrities descended on the city, and Buddy himself competed as an amateur driver. But the track never turned a profit. In 1911, just 2 years after it opened, the Atlanta Speedway closed its gates for good. The property didn't go to waste, though. It became Candler Field, an airstrip that would eventually grow into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Buddy had accidentally helped create one of the busiest airports in the world. In 1910, while the Speedway was still operating, Buddy made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He purchased a ramshackle farmhouse on 42 acres of land on Williams Mill Road, just north of his brother Charles's estate called Callenwold. The property was known as Briercliffe Farm, and at first, that's exactly what Buddy used it for. He threw himself into agriculture with the same enthusiasm he'd brought to racing. He raised cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens, selling meat and produce to local retailers. His dairy operation became famous for its innovations. He installed electric lights and fans in the barns, even individual drinking fountains for the cows. During World War I, Briercliffe Farm supplied milk to Fort Gordon, and agricultural experts praised its cleanliness and efficiency. But farming was never going to be enough for Buddy Candler. As he watched his father's fortune grow and his siblings build grand homes throughout Druid Hills, a different vision began to form in his mind. He didn't want a farm. He wanted a palace. The year 1916 changed everything for the Candler family. Asa Sr. was elected mayor of Atlanta, and to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest, he made a fateful decision. He would give his children their inheritances early and transfer control of the Coca-Cola Company to them. Each of his 5 children received a share of the business worth millions. Family legend holds that Buddy received the smallest portion because his father deducted outstanding debts from his total, possibly as much as $100,000. But even the smallest share of a fortune is still a fortune. 3 years later, in 1919, the Candler children made a decision that would shock their father. They agreed to sell Coca-Cola to a consortium of investors led by Ernest Woodruff for $25 million. In today's money, that figure would be worth well over $300 million. Some say Asa Sr. was furious at the sale. Others suggest he understood that his children wanted to forge their own paths. Either way, Buddy Candler suddenly found himself with more money than he could reasonably spend. Reasonable, however, was never a word anyone associated with Buddy. Now flush with cash, he turned his attention to the humble farmhouse on Briercliffe Farm. What he envisioned wasn't merely a home. It was a statement, a declaration that would prove to everyone, especially his more respectable older brother, that Asa Candler Jr. was somebody worth noticing. Construction began in 1920. Buddy hired architect C.E. Fraser, with Dan Bowden assisting, to design a mansion that would be larger than his father's house, larger even than his brother Charles's impressive Callenwold. The design was Georgian Revival, but the scale was anything but subtle. When completed in 1922, Briercliffe would contain more than 40 rooms, including 7 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, multiple solariums, a grand library with hand-carved wood paneling, and a ballroom on the 3rd floor with 14-foot ceilings painted in gold leaf. The construction cost was staggering. Newspapers reported figures around $30,000 just for the tile work alone. Buddy demanded the finest materials, the most skilled craftsmen, the most elaborate details. He wanted carved marble fireplaces in every bedroom. He wanted coffered ceilings and intricate moldings. He wanted terraced gardens and greenhouses filled with exotic plants. He wanted not 1 but 2 swimming pools, one for his family and one that he would later open to the public, complete with a Coca-Cola stand and landscaped grounds that made it feel like a resort. But Buddy wasn't satisfied with mere luxury. He wanted wonder. In 1925, just 3 years after the main house was completed, Buddy commissioned a massive addition. He built a music room that rose 3 stories high, with a vaulted Tudor ceiling and walls clad in richly carved oak panels. A limestone fireplace 9 feet tall dominated one end of the room, and at the heart of it all stood Buddy's ultimate statement of excess, an Aeolian pipe organ so enormous it rivaled those found in cathedrals. The organ cost $94,000. It had 88 ranks and 187 stops, making it the largest privately owned organ in Georgia. Buddy's father owned an Aeolian organ. His brother Charles owned one too, but Buddy's organ was bigger than both. The room itself, called D. Ovie's Hall, was used to host concerts broadcast on radio station WSB. But the music room was just the beginning of Buddy's transformation of Briercliffe into what the press would call 40 acres of fairyland. He built servants' quarters and a carriage house with apartments for his staff. He constructed tennis courts and a golf course with a putting green. He added stables for horses and kennels for dogs. He landscaped the grounds with terraced gardens that featured fountains, statuary, and exotic plants from around the world. And then, because all of this somehow wasn't enough, Buddy decided that what his estate really needed was a zoo. The private menagerie at Briercliffe became legendary. Buddy acquired animals from around the world, possibly purchasing them from a struggling European circus he encountered during his travels. The collection was astonishing. There were 4 elephants, whom Buddy named Coca-Cola, Refreshing, and Delicious. There was a Bengal tiger and a black leopard. There were lions and bears and exotic birds. There was a gorilla, and there was a baboon who would soon cause Buddy considerable trouble. In 1935, the baboon escaped from its enclosure. It made its way to a neighboring property, where it encountered a woman who was, understandably, terrified. The baboon bit her and, in a detail that the newspapers couldn't resist, stole her purse and devoured $60 in cash. The woman sued Buddy and won $10,000 in damages, a sum worth roughly $225,000 today. The neighbors had been complaining about the noise and smell of the zoo for years. After the baboon incident, Buddy was forced to close his private menagerie. He donated the animals, along with funds for their care, to Grant Park Zoo, which would later become Zoo Atlanta. But before the zoo closed, and before the shadow of darker events fell across the estate, Briercliffe was the center of Atlanta's social universe. Buddy and Helen Candler threw parties that became legend. Politicians came seeking favorable coverage in newspapers that Buddy knew how to influence. Celebrities came for the glamour. Writers and artists came for the spectacle. The parallels to another famous fictional host were not lost on observers. Like J. Gatsby in F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, Buddy Candler threw lavish parties in a magnificent mansion, surrounded himself with excess, and seemed to be chasing something that always remained just out of reach. Family lore claims that Buddy's oldest surviving son, John, once said he had lived like the Great Gatsby during his young adult years at Briercliffe. The comparison feels apt. Like Gatsby, Buddy was new money trying desperately to prove itself. Like Gatsby, he built a monument to his own ambition. And like Gatsby, he would discover that all the gold leaf and champagne in the world couldn't protect him from loss. Helen Candler, the gracious hostess who had stood beside Buddy through all his schemes and dreams, died in January 1927. She was only 40 years old. The local papers praised her as a leading figure in local social and civic circles. Bishop Warren Aiken Candler, Buddy's uncle, officiated at her funeral. She was buried at Westview Cemetery in a plot that Buddy would obsessively design and expand over the coming years. 9 months after Helen's death, Buddy remarried. His new wife was Florence Adeline Stevenson, a widow from Lithonia, Georgia, who had worked as his secretary for 9 years. The speed of the marriage raised eyebrows in Atlanta society, but Buddy seemed unconcerned with public opinion. He never had been. With Florence at his side, Buddy threw himself into new obsessions. He had always been drawn to magic and illusion, to things that defied explanation. Now, in the late 1920s, that interest became all-consuming. He began collecting magical apparatus with the same fervor he'd once devoted to racing cars and exotic animals. He accumulated what was reportedly the largest private collection of magic equipment in the world at the time, filling the third-floor ballroom with trick boxes, disappearing cabinets, and elaborate stage props. And then, Buddy met a young man who would bring his passion for illusion to a tragic end. During a trip to the Philippines, Buddy encountered a talented magician named Jose Cruz. The young performer was skilled, charismatic, and hungry for opportunity. Buddy was enchanted. He invited Jose to return with him to Atlanta, to live at Briercliffe, and to serve as his personal magic tutor and butler. Jose accepted. In April of 1925, the 24-year-old Filipino magician arrived in San Francisco aboard the SS President Taft, along with his younger brother Philemon and another companion. They traveled directly to Atlanta and moved into an apartment above the garage at Briercliffe. For the next several years, Jose became an integral part of life at the mansion. He taught Buddy new tricks, helped organize the legendary magic parties, and assisted with the elaborate shows that Buddy hosted for Atlanta's elite. The third-floor ballroom was transformed into a theater, complete with a secret door that was likely used for disappearing acts. Buddy flew famous magicians into town on his private airplane, including Harry Blackstone, one of the most celebrated performers of the era. Buddy even claimed to have been friends with Harry Houdini himself, though records are unclear whether Houdini ever actually visited Briercliffe. What is known is that Houdini maintained his headquarters in the Candler Building in New York City, which Buddy helped manage, so the two men likely crossed paths at some point. These magic soirees became the talk of Atlanta. High society gathered in Buddy's ballroom to watch illusions performed against walls of gold leaf, their champagne glasses catching the light as impossible things seemed to happen before their eyes. For a few years, Briercliffe was a place where reality itself seemed negotiable, where a wealthy man's whims could conjure elephants and make objects vanish into thin air. But Jose Cruz carried secrets of his own. In the months leading up to that cold January morning in 1931, Jose had begun seeing a young woman named Gladys Fricks. She was a local girl, and their relationship troubled her family. Some accounts suggest they disapproved of Jose's background. Others hint at darker concerns. But Gladys's friends later testified that she seemed happy with Jose, that she had sought out his company, and that on the night of January 17th, she had gone out with him willingly. What happened in the hours that followed remains the subject of speculation. The couple went out that Saturday evening, apparently enjoying each other's company. At some point during the night, they drove to the southern edge of the Briercliffe Estate, near the putting green, where Buddy liked to practice his golf swing. There, in the quiet darkness of that sprawling property, something terrible unfolded. When James Stark found the car the next morning, Jose Cruz was slumped in the driver's seat with a gunshot wound to his temple. Gladys Fricks lay in his lap, dead from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. A note was found in the vehicle, suggesting that their deaths were a double suicide born of thwarted love. But investigators quickly noticed troubling details. The note appeared to be written by a woman, but the handwriting matched Jose's. Only one empty cartridge was found on the floor of the car, yet two people were dead. And the gun, that ivory-handled pistol, belonged to Asa Candler Jr. A coroner's jury was convened that very afternoon. After reviewing the evidence, they reached a verdict that contradicted the suicide note. Jose Cruz, they determined, had murdered Gladys Fricks and then killed himself. She had trusted him. She had gone with him willingly, and he had betrayed that trust in the most final way possible. The murder weapon was displayed by the undertaker. Reporters photographed the ivory-handled pistol and the pearl-handled dagger that had also been found in the car. The story made headlines across Atlanta, and suddenly Briercliffe was famous for something other than parties and elephants. Buddy was not implicated in the deaths. There was no evidence that he knew Jose had taken his gun, and investigators found nothing to suggest any involvement beyond the unhappy coincidence of ownership. But the scandal tainted everything. The magic parties stopped. The ballroom fell silent. Buddy, who had already begun drinking more heavily in the years since Helen's death, seemed to retreat further into himself, and the mansion that had been built for joy began its long, slow descent into shadow. The 1930s arrived like a cold wind through the Georgia pines. The stock market had crashed in October of 1929, and even families as wealthy as the Candlers felt the chill. Buddy's father had died that same year, leaving behind a complicated legacy. The golden age of excess was ending, and Briercliffe's master was beginning to falter. Buddy's drinking became harder to hide. Friends noticed the tremor in his hands. Florence, his second wife, tried to manage both her husband and the estate, but the task was overwhelming. The zoo animals were gone now, donated to Grant Park after the baboon scandal. The magic equipment gathered dust in the ballroom. What kept Buddy going, strangely enough, was death. For more than 20 years, he had been involved in running Westview Cemetery in Atlanta, and he threw himself into this work with characteristic obsessiveness. He oversaw the construction of one of the largest community mausoleums in the world. He designed elaborate monuments and planned garden pathways with the same attention to detail he'd once devoted to Briercliffe's grounds. His own mausoleum at Westview became an obsession. For years, he refined its design, planning the landscaping down to the smallest shrub. The man who had spent his life chasing novelty was now preparing for his final exit. By the late 1930s, Buddy made a surprising decision. He stopped drinking. Whatever the reason, Asa Candler Jr., the man everyone assumed would drink himself to death in his gilded mansion, put down the bottle and stayed sober for the rest of his life. But sobriety couldn't save Briercliffe. The fortune that had seemed endless in 1919 was nearly exhausted. The mansion required constant maintenance, and Buddy's ventures had produced more failures than successes. The costs of running a 42-acre estate were astronomical. By the end of the decade, the writing was on the wall. The fairy tale castle was becoming an albatross. Its grand rooms echoed with the footsteps of a diminished staff. Its gardens grew wilder. The famous swimming pools still sparkled in the Georgia sun, but the crowds of glamorous guests had drifted away. The man who had once commanded elephants and conjured illusions was running out of tricks. The 1940s brought war to America, and with it, a final reckoning for Asa Candler Jr. and his fairy tale estate. While young men shipped off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, the aging heir to the Coca-Cola fortune watched his world crumble around him. The parties had stopped years ago. The magic shows were a distant memory. The elephants and lions had long since found new homes at Grant Park Zoo. What remained was a 42-acre estate that devoured money faster than Buddy could earn it, and a mansion whose grandeur now felt more like mockery than triumph. By 1948, the inevitable could no longer be avoided. Asa Candler Jr., the man who had once thrown the most lavish parties in Atlanta, who had owned the largest private organ in Georgia, who had kept elephants named after his father's soft drink, was forced to sell Briercliffe. The buyer was the General Services Administration, a branch of the federal government. The plan was to convert the estate into a veterans hospital, a place where soldiers returning from World War II could receive medical care. It seemed fitting, in a way. The house built for excess would now serve those who had sacrificed everything. Buddy reportedly received far less than the mansion was worth, a final indignity for a man who had always struggled with money. But the Veterans Hospital never materialized. The plans stalled, budgets shifted, and Briercliffe sat empty, its grand rooms gathering dust while bureaucrats debated its fate. Meanwhile, Buddy and Florence moved out of the mansion they had called home for more than 2 decades. They relocated to the top floor of the Briercliffe Hotel, a building that Buddy himself had developed back in 1924. Located at the corner of Ponce de Leon Avenue and North Highland Avenue in Atlanta's Virginia Highland neighborhood. It was a comfortable penthouse, but it was not Briercliffe. It was not the castle on the hill. For the next 5 years, Buddy lived in that penthouse, surrounded by memories and regrets. He continued his work at Westview Cemetery, overseeing the grounds and refining the design of his own mausoleum. He had spent years planning that final resting place, and now, as his health declined, he could see the end approaching. The man who had always been in motion, always chasing the next grand scheme, was finally slowing down. On January 11th, 1953, Asa Candler Jr. died of liver cancer. He was 72 years old. The newspapers that had once chronicled his escapades, his elephants, his magic shows, and his scandals, now printed brief obituaries. A family friend was quoted saying that Buddy didn't do anything small. It was perhaps the truest thing anyone ever said about him. He was a man of grand gestures, of impossible dreams, of spectacular failures and occasional triumphs. He was buried at Westview Cemetery, in the elaborate mausoleum he had designed himself, not far from where his first wife Helen had been laid to rest more than 25 years earlier. But if Buddy Candler thought his story ended with his death, he was mistaken. The mansion he built would live on, transformed in ways he never could have imagined, accumulating legends and ghosts that would make it famous long after his name was forgotten. In 1953, the same year Buddy died, Briercliffe found its next purpose. The estate became the Georgian Clinic, the first alcohol rehabilitation facility in the state of Georgia. The irony was almost too perfect. The mansion built by a man who had struggled with drinking for much of his adult life was now dedicated to helping others overcome addiction. The grand rooms where champagne had once flowed freely were converted into treatment spaces. The terraced gardens where society ladies had strolled became grounds for patients taking their first sober steps. The Georgian Clinic operated at Briercliffe for several years, and during this time, the swimming pools remained open. Patients were allowed to use them as part of their therapy, swimming laps in the same waters where movie stars and politicians had once splashed during Buddy's legendary parties. But by the late 1950s, budget constraints forced the closure of the pools. They were drained, covered, and eventually forgotten, becoming just another remnant of the estate's gilded past. The addiction center continued operating, eventually becoming known as the DeKalb County Addiction Center. But in 1965, Briercliffe underwent its most dramatic transformation yet. The state of Georgia decided to build the Georgia Mental Health Institute on the property, and what they constructed would change the character of the estate forever. A massive multi-story tower rose on the grounds, a stark modernist structure that looked nothing like Buddy's Georgian revival mansion. The tower was surrounded by a series of smaller buildings, cottages arranged in a semicircular pattern around the main facility. These cottages housed patients, and they were connected to the central hospital by something that would fuel decades of dark legends: underground tunnels. The tunnels were practical in design. They allowed staff to transport patients between buildings regardless of weather, and they provided a secure pathway that kept the mentally ill away from public view. But practical or not, those tunnels captured the imagination of everyone who heard about them. Dark passages beneath a crumbling mansion, connecting buildings full of troubled souls. The concrete corridors stretched for hundreds of feet, lit by bare bulbs that cast long shadows on the walls. Staff members who worked the night shift spoke of strange sounds echoing through those passages, footsteps that seemed to follow them, doors that opened on their own. Whether these were the products of overactive imaginations or something more, no one could say. But the tunnels became the stuff of legend. For 32 years, from 1965 to 1997, the Georgia Mental Health Institute operated on the grounds of Briercliffe. During this time, the original mansion was incorporated into the facility, its elegant rooms subdivided and repurposed for institutional use. Walls were erected where none had existed before. Drop ceilings hid the ornate plasterwork above. Linoleum covered the hardwood floors. The transformation was thorough and heartbreaking to anyone who remembered what the mansion had once been. The music room, with its soaring three-story ceiling and magnificent pipe organ, became Diovi's Hall, used for various therapeutic and administrative purposes. The organ itself was eventually removed. Some accounts say it was gifted to Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, while others suggest it was sold. Either way, by the time the hospital closed, only the console remained, a ghostly reminder of the symphonies that had once filled the room. The ballroom on the third floor, where Buddy had hosted his magic soirees and stored his collection of illusion apparatus, was converted into dormitories for nurses. The secret door that had once been used for disappearing acts was walled over or forgotten. The carved marble fireplaces gathered dust. The gold leaf walls faded and chipped. Layer by layer, the grandeur of Briercliffe was buried beneath institutional paint and fluorescent lighting. And then there were the patients. Thousands of people passed through the Georgia Mental Health Institute during its 3 decades of operation. Some were there voluntarily, seeking help for depression or anxiety. Others were committed against their will, locked away in rooms that had once hosted champagne toasts. The tunnels that connected the buildings saw countless footsteps, countless stories of suffering and recovery, breakdown and healing. Nurses worked long shifts in rooms where socialites had once danced. Doctors held consultations in spaces designed for dinner parties. The contrast between what the mansion had been and what it had become could not have been more stark. The institution treated patients with the methods of its era, some helpful, others now considered barbaric. Electroshock therapy was administered in rooms with carved marble fireplaces. Group therapy sessions were held in the solarium where Buddy's exotic plants had once flourished. The mansion absorbed all of it, its walls becoming repositories for decades of human pain and hope. When the hospital finally closed in 1997, it left behind more than empty buildings. It left behind stories. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. People whispered about strange sounds coming from the abandoned mansion, about lights flickering in windows that should have been dark, about figures seen walking the grounds at night. The tunnels, now sealed and forbidden, became the subject of particular fascination. What had happened down there, in those dark passages where patients had been transported out of sight? One story that emerged involved a former nurse who was spotted wandering the property years after the hospital closed. A local preservation advocate named Charlie Payne encountered her one day, walking across the grounds as if searching for something she had lost. She kept saying that she had been a nurse at the hospital. Payne later recalled looking at her hands as she spoke and seeing blood where she had scratched and picked at her skin. Whatever had happened at the hospital, he realized, had taken a toll on her that never healed. Graffiti began appearing inside the abandoned buildings. Trespassers, drawn by the mansion's growing reputation as a haunted house, broke in to explore and left their marks. One piece of graffiti, scrawled on an indoor fountain in the former solarium, read simply, "It ran with blood." Whether this was a prank by local teenagers or something more sinister, no one could say. But it added to the mythology that was growing around Briercliffe like ivy on its crumbling walls. In 1998, Emory University purchased the property from the government. The university already had deep connections to the Candler family. Asa Candler Jr. had been one of Emory's greatest benefactors, donating millions of dollars and 75 acres of land to help establish the university in Atlanta. Now, Decades later, his grandson's mansion had come full circle, returning to the institution that bore so much of the family's legacy. But Emery didn't know quite what to do with Briercliffe. The mansion was in terrible condition, its roof leaking, its walls damaged by decades of water infiltration.